Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Blood 2: The Chosen for PC. This is a first-person shooter and the sequel to the absolute classic first-person shooter Blood. It was developed by Monolith Productions and published by GT Interactive in 1998 for PC exclusively, and it was generally pretty well received on its launch, although in the years since its release, it's gotten something of a negative reputation as a crappy sequel. Well, we're going to go ahead and delve into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with here and try to ignore what people were saying about it back in the day and see how it actually is as a first-person shooter, and especially how it is as a sequel to the original Blood. And of course we're going to start things off by taking a look at the presentation. Now this runs in the Lithtech engine, and it was actually the second game to do so. The first was Shogo Mobile Armor Division, which was actually released the previous month. Now the thing is, when you get to Blood 2, you can tell that they had a bit more technical mastery of the engine, and as a result you end up with visuals that do look a bit better than Shogo. Now that said, this is a 3D game from 1998, which means that it's looking extremely dated by modern standards, and thus you end up with rather blocky modeling, some kind of clunky animations here and there, and the texture work is generally rather low res. At the time, it looked perfectly fine, in fact it looked rather good. But it definitely has not aged well, and when you compare this especially to the original Blood, it doesn't even hold a candle to how well that game still holds up as far as visuals go. That's the thing about going from 2D to 3D. If you're on 2D graphics, they will generally age a lot better than 3D graphics do. And of course, Blood 2 is no exception there. Now that said, they still have managed to do some fairly nice lighting effects here and there, although it is very limited by the technology of the day, and you do end up with some fairly satisfying blood and gore because, like in the original Blood, they went kind of over the top with it. The blood effects in particular look positively silly because they kind of shoot out in an arc, and it will actually land on the ground or the walls depending on where that arc actually ends. Enemies explode into meaty chunks if you do enough damage to them, and it's generally just a very silly looking game when it comes to the blood and guts. Although when you get down to it, the original Blood was actually quite a bit more gory than this one is, so it's a bit surprising. But then you move over into sound design, you find that things are a bit more consistent. The gun and explosion sounds are decent. They're nothing particularly amazing, but for the era they actually work rather well, although some weapons certainly sound quite a bit better than others. Then of course there's the voice acting, which is actually rather solid for the most part. The characters voice their roles rather well, and of course you've got Caleb constantly cracking wise about things. Although one thing that you will notice is very absent in this compared to the original is the references to works of horror, whether that be books or movies or whatever. They're definitely still there, it's just that they're a lot fewer and further between than what you would see in the original Blood, because the original Blood was basically completely filled to the brim with them. Like I said in my review of the original game, it was so completely packed with references that it was harder to find a gameplay clip that didn't have some degree of a reference in it than ones that did. Blood 2, on the other hand, you kind of had to go out of your way to get to those references, and it's a bit disappointing. But then there's the one aspect of the presentation that's just utterly baffling: the music. I'm not even really sure how to classify it, because it's kind of all over the place. I guess the closest word to describe it would be techno, but even then, that's not exactly the full spectrum, because you've got some that sound like they're just remixes of a bunch of different sounds slapped together, and they're like, hey, this constitutes music now. And some of it's trying to sound like it's more atmospheric horror music, and you get even some things that are a bit more choral arrangements. It's really all over the place, and while some of it works, most of it's just very underwhelming. Thus, when you bring all of the presentation together and sum it up, it just ends up being a very mixed bag, because on the one hand, the visuals are mostly fine, it's just that they're very dated by modern standards, and while you have pretty solid sound effects and voice acting, the music's just kind of a mess. But here's the thing, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this actually takes up considerably more time than it did in the original Blood. Because unlike in the original Blood, this game actually does have a storyline, and it does have a fair few cutscenes in it, all of which are unskippable, which in 1998 was annoying. Now it's completely unforgivable. The only real saving grace of the cutscenes in this is that they're fairly short, so they never really take up too much of your time before you get back into the madness of the gameplay, but still, it gets pretty annoying when they come in. Thing is, you actually can skip the cutscenes by using a workaround. You don't play as Caleb. Instead of playing as Caleb, you play as one of the other Chosen, because you can actually go through the entirety of the single-player campaign as not only Caleb, but also any of the other Chosen. So if you decide to play as Ophelia, Gabriella, or Ishmael, then you actually don't get any cutscenes in the game at all. Whenever they're supposed to pop up, nothing happens. This includes at the end of levels when the game actually normally does a cutscene, and then you just kind of sit there awkwardly waiting for the amount of time that the cutscene normally would take up to be finished before it will just move on to the next level. Bit of a design oversight there, and it is a bit annoying, but regardless, if you don't want any of the story stuff, then you might as well just play with one of the other Chosen, because the only real story you get in the game is through those cutscenes. So of course that brings up what the story actually is. Well, the game is set 100 years after the events of the original Blood, which has been retroactively dated to 1928, and thus this game takes place in 2028, where the Cabal has not been destroyed by what you did in the original Blood, but instead has gradually turned into a megacorporation named Cabalco, and they pretty much rule the world effectively. What Caleb has done over the past 100 or so years is actually very unclear. The game doesn't really tell you, and even the manual and the supplementary material that you'd find on their website and such really doesn't give a good indication of what he's been doing. The promotional material said he's been looking for a way to resurrect the other Chosen that were betrayed and killed in the original Blood, but you don't get any of that in the game itself, and the game itself generally keeps him as a very muddled character who doesn't really have much motivation other than he really hates the Cabal. So as you go through the game, you find out that the Cabal is now led by a guy named Gideon who seeks to resurrect the dark god Chernobog and of course destroy Caleb. This really annoys Caleb, so he ends up chasing after Gideon and eventually finds out that they're running some experiments that are causing some issues with dimensional rifts and such. This explains the random creatures that just keep popping up out of nowhere seemingly, and that will fight both you and the Cabal. Now, I've already spoiled enough of the story, but suffice to say, once you get further on into the game, things get weirder and weirder, and they try to shoehorn in the idea that Chernobog is a bit more than just an evil god, and there's actually some more significance to that. But the way they do that is fairly flimsy, and the plot ends up being very weak as a result. By the end of the first chapter even, you don't really give too much of a crap about what the story is. You're focused way more on the gameplay, especially considering that that's going to be what's going to ultimately make or break this thing for you. Now, if you've played the original Blood, then going to this one's going to be a fairly easy transition because they actually do play pretty similarly. Several of the weapons do return from the previous game, although this being set in 2028, a lot of it's been modernized. So for example, instead of a Tommy gun, you get access to a MAC-10, which you can also dual wield. But there are also several new weapons you get to mess around with, like the sniper rifle or the singularity generator or the orb. And the general idea with this game is that you use that vast arsenal of weaponry to absolutely annihilate everything in your path. And here's the general rule of thumb for applying this vast arsenal of weaponry in the game. If it moves, blast it. If it doesn't move, blast it anyway because it probably has either a health pickup or an ammo pickup or an armor pickup or something along those lines in it. And trust me, you will be absolutely scouring the level for every single health and armor pickup you can possibly find, because this game goes beyond simply being very difficult like the original Blood was and becomes outright bullshit most of the time. You see, the AI in this game is absolutely awful. They will constantly get stuck on walls, they'll get stuck on doors, they'll get stuck on things in the environment. They will stand utterly mystified that you were capable of hopping onto a small box and being able to shoot at them from a slightly elevated position, where they could still very easily hit you, but their AI is not capable of comprehending this. But that doesn't really matter so much when there are two factors that come into play. The first of them is that the damage modeling is very inconsistent. It actually does have location-based damage, but it doesn't really matter so much because half the time you'll hit the target in the exact same spot and it will not have the same effect. It seems like a total crapshoot as to whether or not the location-based damage actually is going to work. This results in a situation where sometimes it will take only one shot to bring an enemy down, and other times it will take dozens of shots to bring an enemy down. And it's not even just the really powerful enemies that are like that, it's the weak ones too. If you're just going up against the basic cultists, they're still going to take quite a few hits to bring down, some of the time, and other times they'll just go down instantly. It's wildly inconsistent. What's much worse than that is the fact that every single enemy in this game that is hit scan is pinpoint accurate from a mile away. And the worst part is, these are supposed to be the fodder enemies. The more powerful enemies either are melee or have dodgeable projectiles. Or at least sort of dodgeable projectiles. It really depends on how far away from that enemy you are, because if you're close, then you're just going to get hit because you're too slow to move out of the way. Well, unless you're Ophelia. But I digress. The point is that these hit scan enemies become outright infuriating because they will take your health down from max to basically nothing in the span of maybe a second. I'm not even exaggerating. Look at this.
Oh, you son of... Then you're dying.
Must get away. Not last much longer.
Oh, and in case you're wondering, that's on the normal difficulty. You see, the game's difficulty settings are wildly unbalanced. The easy mode is ridiculously easy, the normal mode is basically what would be the hard difficulty in just about any other first-person shooter, and it's a very hard difficulty at that. And the hard difficulty makes you wonder if the game is specifically designed to piss you off. There is no sweet spot difficulty for this particular game. Either it's too hard or it's too easy, and there's nothing in between. But the problem isn't that it's a difficult game, it's that it's difficult for the wrong reasons. It'd be one thing if you went down based on your own lack of skill, but that's not really what happens here. What happens is that you get hit with a ridiculous amount of hit scan damage, and then you just go from basically full health down to basically nothing in the span of maybe a second or two. You basically can't react to that. And thus, a lot of the game ends up coming down to trial and error. You just keep trying over and over and over again until eventually you manage to get lucky enough to get through an area without dying. Of course, that's assuming you don't come up against the most deadly foe in the entire game, which is the doors. Yeah, that was a really weird glitch. Speaking of glitches, the game has quite a few of them, and they're very annoying when they happen. It also has some general stability problems that I can't tell if that's just because of the game itself, or because I'm trying to run it on modern hardware, but it crashes frequently. I also can't run the game in anything higher than 1280 by 720, because if I do, then it just instantly crashes whenever I start it up. Never mind that the engine actually supports 1080p, and in fact that's one of the selectable options in the options menu. But I'm digressing from my point about the combat system, which is basically that even though you do have a pretty cool arsenal to work with, and even though the general feedback that you get from blasting enemies is very satisfying, it ends up just being infuriating to play. There are numerous moments throughout the game where it will just spawn enemies basically right on top of you in an enclosed area, meaning that you're going to take damage whether you want to or not. There's so many instances where they throw quite a lot of hit scan enemies at you, all of which can hit you at the same time, all of which do lots of damage, and all of which are pinpoint accurate. And there's so many moments where you will take this ridiculous amount of damage and find that the game is really stingy on the amount of health and armor pickups it gives you. Those are just scattered around the levels haphazardly. It's like they weren't even really thought out. In fact, a whole lot of this game feels like it wasn't very well thought out, and I think part of that is because the game was actually rushed. And that becomes readily apparent when you look at the level design, particularly the reuse of levels verbatim. For example, you have to go through the exact same subway train level 3 times. It is literally the same layout, but they change up which enemies are there. And that's not the only level they do this for. There are numerous levels throughout the game where they just recycle either sections or the entirety of previous levels, and there doesn't really seem to be any particular reason for it other than just sheer laziness. It really does seem like several of these levels were just haphazardly slapped together to fill space so they could say they had so many levels in a particular episode. Well, I should say chapter, because the episodes are split into chapters now and they're all played in sequence as opposed to being able to select which individual chapter you want to go to, like in the previous game. But I digress again. In this particular instance, I have to wonder if this is because they rushed the game. Because there are numerous unused sound files and dialogue sections and such like that in the game files still that actually would indicate there are more levels or there are different areas to explore within the levels or something along those lines that just never made it into the full game. Whatever the case, the level design often feels downright lazy as a result of the constant reuse of environments as well as the often over-reliance on corridors or just open, empty areas that don't really have anything interesting in them. A lot of the levels require you to do quite a bit of backtracking, and it ends up just getting kind of tedious because you go back to an old area and you're like, oh, well, there's gonna be enemies here now. Oh, and I bet they're gonna be hit scan. It just gets frustrating in the long run. Now, that's not to say that there's not a fair bit of content in the base game, even with the omissions due to being rushed. It ended up having 33 levels on launch, split into 4 chapters, and while a few levels do stand out as being alright, most of them are just extremely bland. Meanwhile, you go back to the original Blood, and it's just crazy how much detail they packed into everything and how unique most of the levels felt. And there's certainly no level anywhere near the quality of something like the Dark Carnival in this one, that's for sure. And the level design generally being lackluster at absolute best really does drag this thing down quite a bit, because you do have decent combat once you get past the hit scan enemies, but then there's the level layouts, which are just kind of a mess. And really that's one of the big factors that leads to this game being extremely disappointing if you were a fan of the original Blood. And it really didn't help that the game originally launched with a ton of bugs, although most of those have been ironed out by patching, or at least the ones that are particularly serious. There's still a few here and there that'll pop up and get kind of annoying, but it's certainly nothing game-breaking. The real problem is that they simply rushed the game out way too quickly. They didn't have time to actually test anything, and they didn't really have time to actually fix the gameplay problems that really plague it. And what you end up with is a very wimpy sequel to one of the finest first-person shooters ever made. All the elements are still there. It's still got a pretty cool arsenal, you've still got dual wielding, you've still got power-ups, you've still got wacky lines here and there, you've got a general sense of dark humor throughout, you've even got boss fights at the end of every single chapter. But unfortunately, those elements aren't mixed together in a way that actually makes the game worth playing. Instead, it makes it something that maybe die-hard Blood fans will be able to enjoy, but most people probably won't be able to. A similar kind of problem happens for the expansion pack, which was the Nightmare levels, which adds 6 levels to the game, which are basically an attempt to add some degree of backstory to the various Chosen. The problem with that, though, is that a couple of levels feel like complete rehashes of stuff that was in the original Blood, and then a couple more of them are just not really all that consequential in the long run. Now, to be fair, the expansion is only 6 levels, and they couldn't really do a whole lot with story for that, but it is still really disappointing. Not to mention that as an expansion pack, it's just crap, because you only get 6 levels, 2 new weapons, and then 2 reskinned enemies, 1 reskin for bystanders, and then 2 new enemies, which are really just not all that interesting, and one of which is a boss enemy. It's really minimal in content, especially for an expansion pack of that era, and what you end up with is something that is really only worth messing around with if you get it bundled together with the main game. Which luckily these days on digital distribution it is actually bundled together, so if you get the game on GOG or Steam for example, then you get both the base game and the Nightmare levels. So while I could certainly see messing around with the expansion pack if you got it bundled together with the main game, I really can't see recommending that on an individual basis, so I definitely won't be doing that. In fact, I won't be recommending the game in general. It's something that only a small niche of players is really going to be able to get the most out of, and those people are die-hard Blood fans. I mean, don't get me wrong, I absolutely love the hell out of the original Blood, but when you get to Blood 2 The Chosen and its expansion pack, it's just a mess. It's not worth playing unless you are a die-hard fan of the original and you can put up with the glaring faults that the sequel has. If you're a general fan of old-school first-person shooters, just play the original Blood and just know that this was a thing, but there's not really much of a reason to play it unless you can get it for dirt cheap. I will still have a link in the video description box to where you can pick this up on GOG and Steam if you're interested, and when it goes on sale for really cheap, that's really the only instance I can recommend even thinking about picking it up. Because when you get down to it, Blood 2 is a very weak sequel to one of the finest first-person shooters ever made, and all you're really going to get out of Blood 2 is a hell of a lot of frustration and not very much fun. Thanks for watching.